So with recent reviews of a biography of Stalin and an autobiography of Vladimir Nabokov, and now this book, I don't want you to get worried and think I've turned into some sort of, well, Trotskyite, or had some other major ideological shift. But this is the next book I have to review for everyone. This is Trotsky, Downfall of a Revolutionary, by Bertrand M. Patenaude. A really wonderful book about, I think, someone whose life and times is not really that discussed. We recognize the name, but may not know exactly what he did or why he was important. Beyond being vaguely associated with the Russian Revolution in 1917, his name seems to many times get lost in the mix. Everyone knows it, but it might also conclude that it was somewhat of lesser importance because he never led the Communist Party, whereas Stalin and Lenin did both. Trotsky's legacy comes from the ideological bulwark that he provided against what he perceived to be Stalin's increasing bureaucracy and his increasing brutality in his regime. In less than 3 years, from 1925, Trotsky was removed from a series of positions, including Commissar for Military and Naval Affairs, and then he was expelled from the Communist Party altogether, and then he was expelled from Russia altogether. But none of this deterred him, and in fact, the vast majority of this book occurs well after all of those things happened, and as I will talk about, the last 3 years of his life. Trotsky was always a thorn in Stalin's backside. Even when he was in the party, he was always speaking up when he disagreed with Stalin, whereas other people who had some survival instinct knew when to be quiet because they knew what kind of person Stalin was. He would speak up and he would say something. Of course, this eventually got him not only thrown out of the party, but Russia. For his constant interference in party politics, which did not stop when he was forced out of Russia. And to satisfy himself, that is Stalin, until he caught Trotsky himself, Stalin very likely saw to the deaths of 2 of Trotsky's own children. He was certainly responsible for the arrest and shooting of Sergei, and very likely responsible for the death of Lieva, his other son, who died as a result, at least this is the official NKVD story, who died as a result of a botched operation for appendicitis. However, the Trotskys have very good reason to think that he was poisoned or shot or something else. Trotsky's 2 daughters, Nina and Zenaida, also died before he did, but from tuberculosis and suicide, respectively. So by the end of his life, in 1940, Trotsky had seen all 4 of his children die, which I think is losing one child is hard enough, right? But seeing all 4 of them die, and sometimes having to guess the circumstances under which they might have died, that's got to be a horrendous, angst-filled life to live. After losing the battle to succeed Lenin, after Lenin died in 1924, Stalin exiled Trotsky to Turkey, where he stayed until he moved to France in 1933, and then finally to Norway in 1935. But in August of 1936, the first of the infamous Moscow show trials were held, which accused Communist Party members of the most outrageous, egregious of crimes, including the attempt the attempted assassination of Stalin himself. And these show trials really accused Trotsky of being the mastermind of all of these crimes, pretty much single-handedly. He in Stalin's own mind, at least, and so he wanted other Russian people to believe, that Stalin was really the enemy of communism, or that Trotsky was the enemy of communism, and that he was counter-revolutionary working at cross purposes to destroy what the revolution had achieved. And because of the mounting international pressures associated with these trials, Norway actually was finally forced to expel Trotsky as well, even though he'd already moved several times. So where is he going to go? Right, the leftist, sympathetic president of Mexico, whose name was Lázaro Cárdenas, invited Trotsky to stay there in the country as sort of a measure of personal solidarity. It was pretty much the only country in the world who would take him, and he invited him not just because he agreed with him politically, but because he felt that he might have some sort of personal affinity for him. So Trotsky and his wife, Natalia, arrived in Mexico in January of 1937. And this is where the book really begins, January of 1937, tracking Trotsky's life through 1940, when one of Stalin's many henchmen finally track him down and, of course, assassinate him, if you are familiar with the arc of his life. When the Trotskys arrived in Mexico, the artist Diego Rivera, who had long called himself a Trotskyite, and his wife Frida Kahlo, the famous artist, invited them to stay at their home, called the Casa Azul, the Blue House, in Coyoacán, which was at the time just outside of Mexico, but is today actually within the metropolitan limits of Mexico City. Which was at the time outside of Mexico City and is now within it. So not only did Rivera display political empathy towards his friend's idea, sort of like President Cárdenas did, but also went out of his way to provide funds for Trotsky. And I'm not just talking about food and everyday living expenses, but this is a man who is, for all intents and purposes, on an international hit list. If Stalin wants you dead, you're not safe just because you're on the other side of the world. You're still in danger, and Rivera knew that, and Frida Kahlo knew that, and no one knew it better than, of course, Trotsky himself. So Rivera went to extreme limits, even selling his own paintings. He even mortgaged his own house to provide Trotsky with a retinue of security that he needed to almost make it day to day and week to week. Despite Rivera's generosity, Trotsky and Frida Kahlo had an affair, which lasted for several months in early 1937. Despite what some people think, Diego Rivera almost certainly never found out about this, because according to what many people would have thought of Rivera's personality, he may have very well beaten Stalin to the punch with assassinating him. He was extremely jealous of Frida and probably would not have tolerated that kind of behavior, even though he was a much, much bigger womanizer and Lothario than Frida ever was a cheater. So, like I said, Diego never found out, but Natalia, Trotsky's wife, did find out, and it almost ended their 34-year marriage. But we have a series of letters and correspondence between the two during that part of 1937, which really shows how they managed to reconcile things and even sort of become closer over that period of time. Just a few months after the arrival of Trotsky in Mexico, the Dewey Commission, headed by none other than the famous American pragmatist, philosopher, and educational innovator John Dewey, was held at the Casa Azul. The purpose of the Dewey Commission was to investigate the methods used in the Moscow show trials. And needless to say, the commission found that the show trials, kangaroo courts as they were pretty much completely flawed from top to bottom, and that Trotsky was actually not guilty, and that the methodologies and evidence presented against Trotsky during these trials was anything from false to fabricated to just full of paranoia, and they essentially concluded that the case against Trotsky had not been proved. Of course, this did little to satisfy Stalin, the paranoid egomaniac that he was, whose authority was basically inherently undermined by the Dewey Commission, and who still wanted to see Trotsky dead. In May of 1940, Trotsky survived an attempted assassination plot by the NKVD, which is the Russian secret service, secret police, kind of, by an NKVD agent and Rivera's major artistic opponent. He's another famous Mexican artist of the first half of the 20th century. You may have heard of him. His name is David Alfaro Siqueiros. Trotsky and Natalia both survived, virtually unscathed in their bedrooms, but their grandson was shot, but I believe survived. So, not long after this, due to personal and political differences with Diego Rivera, who was really never a Trotskyite, despite what he called himself. He was more of a sort of a populist. The Trotskys end up moving out of the Casa Azul around this time. Trotsky knew that he had to turn his new house into a fortress, basically, to protect himself. But on August 20th, 1940, half a world away, of course, Stalin being in Russia, Trotsky still being in Mexico, Stalin tries again to kill Trotsky. And this time he enlisted the help of a man named Ramon Mercader, who was a Spanish Catalan communist. Mercader managed to gain access to Trotsky's house through sort of pretending to fall in love with, I think, the daughter of one of his bodyguards or something like that. It was very much of a long shot, but he did it. He gains access to Trotsky's personal study, where Trotsky's working, and he takes an ice pick to his head, basically. Trotsky dies the next day from the severe head wounds that he incurs. Mercader spends 20 years in prison, but was rewarded for his efforts by Stalin for being given both the Order of Lenin and was recognized as being a hero of the Soviet Union. A hero of the Soviet Union for murdering Trotsky. So the whole arc of this book basically tells that story. I haven't told you everything in the book, but I've tried to highlight some of the major details. And if any of this sounds interesting, it sort of fills in a lot of gaps around Trotsky's life, his role in the party, and even though it focuses in on 1937 to 1940, there are these occasional flashbacks that give you some sort of historical context on why Stalin and Trotsky didn't get along so well in later years. A really, really well done book. If you're curious about the subject, Russian history, Russian political history, certainly something to look into. This is Trotsky, Downfall of a Revolutionary by Bertrand and Patenaude. See you later, guys.